The dust-laden wind carried the scent of desperation across the parched landscape as Lydia Barrett stumbled forward, her two small children clinging to her tattered skirts. The year was 1874, and the unforgiving Texas frontier had taken everything from her, everything except the precious lives she'd vowed to protect with her last breath. That last breath seemed dangerously close now, as black spots danced at the edges of her vision and her legs trembled beneath her. "Just a little further," she whispered to 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old James, her voice cracking from thirst. 3 days without proper water, 5 days with nothing but a few bites of stale bread to share among them. The homestead was lost to fire, her husband Thomas to a bullet from land grabbers who decided the modest Barrett claim was worth killing for. The distant outline of what might be buildings wavered in the heat shimmer. Lydia blinked, unsure if it was real or just another cruel mirage that had led them astray before. Her feet dragged through the loose dirt, each step heavier than the last. "Mama, I can't walk no more," James whimpered, his small face streaked with dirt and tears. "We must, darling," she murmured, though her own strength was fading fast. Just a little." The world tilted suddenly. Lydia felt her knees buckle as the ground rushed up to meet her. The last thing she heard was Emma's frightened cry before darkness claimed her. Miles Grayson had been tracking a stray calf when he spotted them, a woman and 2 small children, making their faltering way across the open range toward the town of Redemption Springs. Even from a distance, he could tell they were in trouble. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks, covering the ground between them in a gallop. He was too late to catch her before she fell. By the time he dismounted and rushed to her side, the woman lay crumpled in the dirt, her children clutching at her skirts, sobbing in terror. "Mama, Mama, wake up." The little girl cried, shaking her mother's shoulder. Miles knelt beside them, quickly assessing the situation. The woman's pulse was weak but present. Her skin burned with fever and her lips were cracked from dehydration. The children looked hardly better, thin, dirty, and clearly terrified of the stranger who now loomed over them. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm going to help your ma." The boy stepped protectively in front of his sister. "Don't hurt her," he demanded, though his voice trembled. "I won't," Miles promised. He reached for his canteen, uncorking it and carefully lifting the woman's head to let a few drops of water pass her parched lips. "What's your name, son?" "James," the boy answered warily. "This is my sister Emma." "Our mama is Lydia." Miles nodded, studying the unconscious woman's face. Even gaunt with exhaustion and illness, he could see she was beautiful, high cheekbones, dark lashes, and hair that might be golden when not dulled by dust and sweat. "My name's Miles Grayson. I work at the Diamond G Ranch just over that rise." He nodded toward the distant hills. "Your ma needs help and you two look like you could use some food and rest." The little girl Emma stepped forward hesitantly. "Mama said we had to get to town. The bad men might come back." Miles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "What bad men?" "The ones who shot Papa," James said bluntly, his young voice hardened by trauma no child should know. "They burned our house." Miles's jaw tightened. Land disputes and claim jumping weren't uncommon in these parts, but the thought of children witnessing such violence made his blood boil. He'd seen too much of man's inhumanity during the war and had hoped to leave such ugliness behind when he headed west. "Listen," he said, making a quick decision. "I'm going to take your ma to my cabin. It's safe there and I can tend to her." He looked at the children's frightened faces. "She collapsed by you, but I promise I'll get you fed before she wakes." The children exchanged a look that spoke volumes about what they'd already endured. Finally, James gave a small nod. "Can you both ride?" Miles asked. When they nodded, Miles gently lifted Lydia into his arms. She was frighteningly light, as though the hardships she'd faced had already whittled away parts of her. Settling her carefully across his saddle, he mounted behind her, then helped the children up, positioning Emma in front of him and James behind, clinging to his belt. "Hold tight now," he instructed, turning his horse toward home. The Diamond G wasn't a grand spread, not like some of the cattle empires springing up across Texas. Old Man Grayson, no relation, despite the shared surname, had hired Miles 3 years earlier, impressed by the young veteran's way with horses and his straightforward manner. When the old rancher died last winter, he'd left Miles the small cabin and enough acreage to start his own modest ranch. It wasn't much, but it was more than Miles had ever expected to call his own. The cabin came into view as they crested a small rise, a simple structure of logs and stone with a lean-to stable beside it. Miles had expanded it some since taking ownership, adding a small porch and a second room. It was Spartan but clean, and right now it was the only sanctuary available. He dismounted carefully, keeping Lydia secure in his arms while helping the children down. "James, can you open that door for me?" The boy hurried to comply, pushing open the heavy wooden door. Miles carried Lydia inside, laying her gently on his bed. Her face was flushed with fever, but her breathing seemed steady. "Emma, there's a bucket by the pump out back. Can you fill it partway? James, help your sister." The children nodded solemnly and hurried to their task, seemingly relieved to have something useful to do. Miles quickly gathered clean cloths and the few medicines he kept on hand: willow bark for fever, whiskey for disinfecting, salves for burns and cuts. He'd learned basic doctoring during the war, skills that had proven invaluable on the frontier where proper physicians were scarce. When the children returned with water, Miles soaked a cloth and gently bathed Lydia's face, trying to bring down her fever. "Now," he said to the children, "I promised you food. Let's see what we can find while your ma rests." In the small kitchen area, Miles stirred up the banked fire in his cookstove and put on a pot of beans that had been soaking. He sliced thick pieces of cornbread left from his breakfast and found some dried apple slices and beef jerky in his stores. It wasn't a feast, but to the hungry children it seemed like one. "Eat slowly now," he cautioned as they fell upon the food. "Too much too fast will make you sick." As they ate, Miles encouraged them to talk, partly to distract them from their mother's condition and partly to piece together their story. Through their fragmented account, he learned that Thomas Barrett had staked a claim on land about 20 miles east. They'd built a small farm, working the land for nearly 2 years before men from the newly formed Blackwater Ranch Company showed up, claiming they had papers to the entire region. "Papa said they were lying," Emma explained, her small face serious. "He showed them his papers, but they just laughed." "They came back at night," James continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They shot Papa when he went outside. Mama grabbed us and ran out the back when they started burning the house." Miles felt a familiar cold anger settle in his chest. The Blackwater outfit was notorious in the territory, a consortium of Eastern investors buying up land by any means necessary, legal or otherwise. Their hired guns had already forced out several small ranchers and homesteaders, but murder and arson marked a dangerous escalation. "You're safe here," Miles assured them, though he knew the promise might be hollow. If Blackwater had decided to clear this territory, one man with a rifle wouldn't stop them. But he'd be damned if he wouldn't try. A soft moan from the bedroom interrupted his thoughts. The children immediately abandoned their food and rushed to their mother's side. Miles followed, bringing a cup of water. Lydia's eyes fluttered open, confusion and panic flashing across her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. She tried to sit up, reaching instinctively for her children. "Easy," Miles said, gently restraining her. "You're safe. Your children are safe." "Mama," Emma cried, throwing her arms around Lydia's neck. James stood more solemnly at the bedside, but relief shone clearly in his eyes. "Where?" Lydia's voice was barely audible, her throat too dry to form words properly. Miles held the cup to her lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "My name is Miles Grayson. I found you collapsed with your young ones out on the range, brought you to my cabin to recover." Lydia drank gratefully, her eyes never leaving his face as though trying to determine if he represented a new threat. Miles couldn't blame her for her suspicion. In her place, he'd be wary too. The children? Have they eaten? She asked, her first concern clearly for them. Miles nodded, something warming in his chest at her selflessness. Just like I promised, got them fed before you woke. He offered a small smile. Though it was a near thing, you weren't out for long. Lydia sank back against the pillow, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Thank you, she whispered. We've been walking for days. I thought we might die out there. You're safe now, Miles repeated, though the words still felt inadequate against the reality they faced. Rest. We'll talk more when you're stronger. Over the next several days, Lydia slowly regained her strength. The fever broke on the second night, and by the third day she was able to sit up and take broth and small portions of food. Miles had given up his bed to her and the children, making do with a bedroll near the fireplace. During the day, he continued his ranch work, checking on his small herd of cattle and tending to necessary chores. But he found himself hurrying through tasks that usually took all day, eager to return to the cabin. The children had latched onto him almost immediately, following him around like faithful pups when he was home, peppering him with questions about ranch life, horses, and the war, though he kept those stories heavily edited. James was particularly fascinated by Miles's gun, belt, and spurs, while Emma had discovered a tattered book of poetry on his shelf and begged him to read to her each evening. It was an odd feeling, having a household suddenly full after years of solitude. Odder still was how quickly it began to feel natural, as though the empty spaces in his cabin had been waiting for them all along. On the fourth evening, Miles returned from checking his fences to find Lydia up, and dressed in clothes he recognized, as his own an old shirt tucked into pants that were comically large on her slender frame, but cinched with rope at the waist. Her hair, now clean and brushed, hung in a golden braid over one shoulder. She was at his stove stirring something that smelled far better than his usual fare. You shouldn't be up, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Lydia turned, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough without contributing. Besides, lying abed makes me feel useless. Where are the little ones, gathering eggs from your hens? They were excited to have a job, she gestured to the pot. I hope you don't mind. I found your stores and thought to make a proper stew. Miles washed his hands in the basin by the door, acutely aware of how domestic the scene felt and how dangerously easy it would be to grow accustomed to it. I don't mind at all. Been a long while since I had a woman's cooking. Do you live here alone? Lydia asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by the personal question. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. Nothing to be sorry for, and yes, just me. The ranch isn't much 20 head of cattle, some chickens, 2 good horses, and 1 ornery mule. He smiled slightly. It's enough for one man. Lydia stirred the pot thoughtfully. It's a fine place. You've been very kind to us, Mr. Grayson. Miles, he corrected gently. And kindness had little to do with it. Couldn't very well leave a woman and children stranded. He paused, then added, Your boy told me some of what happened. I'm sorry about your husband. Grief darkened her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Thomas was a good man. He believed in building something for our children, something that would last. Her hand tightened on the wooden spoon. The men who killed him will face justice somehow, I have to believe that. Miles leaned against the doorframe, choosing his words carefully. Blackwater has powerful friends, Mrs. Barrett. The law in these parts? He shook his head. It's not always reliable. Lydia, she said quietly. If I'm to call you Miles, you should use my given name. She met his eyes directly. And I'm aware of the limitations of frontier justice, Mr. Miles, but I can't simply let them take everything and walk away. I owe Thomas more than that. I owe my children more. Before Miles could respond, the door burst open and the children tumbled in, James proudly holding a basket with 4 brown eggs. Mr. Miles, look what we found, Emma exclaimed. Mama's making stew. The serious conversation shelved for the moment. Miles smiled and knelt to admire their treasure. Fine work, you two. Those hens can be mighty particular about giving up their eggs. Dinner that night was the best Miles had eaten in years. The stew was simple but well seasoned, and Lydia had somehow managed to make biscuits with his limited supplies. As they ate, the tension of their earlier conversation faded, replaced by the children's chatter and an easy companionship that felt both foreign and familiar to Miles. After the meal, while the children played a game Miles had taught them with stones and a marked board, Lydia drew him outside to the porch. The evening was cool, stars just beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. "I need to ask you something," she said without preamble. "And I need you to be honest with me." Miles nodded, waiting. "Is there any chance at all that I could reclaim our land? Legally, I mean." Thomas had proper papers, all filed with the land office in Austin. Miles considered this. "Those papers might still count for something if you have them. But Blackwater has lawyers, money to drag out any fight, and there's the matter of your safety. They've already shown they're willing to kill." Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, gazing out at the darkening land. "The papers burned with our home. I have nothing but my word and my children." She turned to face him. "I need to get to town, to send a wire to my brother in Kansas City. He'll help us." Miles felt a strange disappointment at her words. Of course she would have family somewhere. Of course she wouldn't stay here indefinitely, in his small cabin with a man she barely knew. "I can take you tomorrow," he offered. "Redemption Springs is half a day's ride." "Thank you." Lydia hesitated, then added, "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "There's no debt between us," Miles said firmly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Lydia said softly. "They wouldn't have. I've seen enough of the world to know that." She met his eyes in the gathering darkness. "Why did you really help us, Miles? The truth." Miles looked away, uncomfortable with the directness of her gaze. "I saw too much suffering during the war, too many widows, too many orphans. Maybe I'm just trying to balance the scales a bit." Lydia studied him for a long moment. "There's more to you than you let on, Miles Grayson." He managed a small smile. "Could say the same about you, Lydia Barrett." They stayed on the porch a while longer, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. When they finally went inside, Miles found the children had fallen asleep on his bedroll near the fire. Without discussion, he and Lydia carried them to the bed, tucking them in carefully. "I'll take the floor tonight," Lydia whispered. "Not necessary." "I'm used to it," Miles countered. Their eyes met over the sleeping children, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange intimacy of the moment, of caring for children together as though they were a family. "Good night, Miles," Lydia said finally, her voice barely audible. "Good night, Lydia," he replied, retreating to his spot by the fire. Sleep was long in coming that night, his thoughts filled with golden hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of heat. Miles rose early, as was his habit, to find Lydia already awake and preparing a simple breakfast. The domesticity of it struck him again, how quickly she had found her place in his home, how natural it felt to see her there in the early light, humming softly as she worked. "The children are still sleeping," she said quietly as he approached. "They needed the rest." Miles nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd already brewed. "We should let them sleep a while longer. Town can wait an hour or two." They ate in companionable silence until Lydia suddenly set down her cup with a determined expression. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Blackwater and their influence. And you're right that I can't fight them legally, not without money or evidence, but I can't simply disappear either." She met his eyes steadily. "They murdered my husband, Miles, in front of our children. If they're allowed to get away with it, they'll only grow bolder." Miles understood her need for justice all too well. He'd seen that same look in the eyes of men during the war, the dangerous, burning need to make things right, to balance the scales no matter the cost. "What are you planning?" He asked cautiously. "I'm not sure yet, but I know I need allies, information." She hesitated. "I need to know who's behind Blackwater, who gave the orders to clear us out, to kill." Miles set down his own cup. "That kind of information could get you killed, Lydia. These aren't men who play by any rules." "I'm already dead in their eyes," she replied with a bitter smile. A woman alone with 2 children, no land, no money. They won't see me as a threat. That might be my only advantage." Before Miles could argue further, the sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention. He was on his feet instantly, moving to the window while reaching for the rifle kept near the door. "Stay back," he warned Lydia, peering cautiously through the curtain. 3 riders approached the cabin, dust rising behind them in the morning light. Miles recognized the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Walter Dawson from Redemption Springs. The other 2 were strangers, but their fine clothes and Eastern saddles marked them as out of place on the frontier. "It's the sheriff," Miles told Lydia, whose face had gone pale, "and company." "They've found us," she whispered. "We don't know that yet." Miles set the rifle aside but kept his revolver on his hip as he stepped onto the porch to meet the riders. "Morning, Miles," the sheriff called, pulling his horse to a stop. He was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. "Got a moment?" "Always for you, Sheriff," Miles replied evenly. "Who are your friends?" The sheriff glanced uncomfortably at his companions. "This here is Mr. Harlan Davis and Mr. George Whitfield. They're representatives of the Blackwater Ranch Company." Miles kept his expression neutral despite the anger that flared at the confirmation. "What brings Blackwater to my doorstep?" The better-dressed of the 2 men, Davis, urged his horse forward. "We're looking for a woman and 2 children, squatters who fled after an unfortunate incident on Blackwater property." "Squatters," Miles raised an eyebrow, "thought they were homesteaders with legal claim." Davis's eyes narrowed. "So you have seen them?" "Didn't say that," Miles countered, "just repeating what I've heard around." The second man, Whitfield, spoke up. "Their presence here could be problematic for you, Mr. Grayson. Harboring fugitives is a serious matter." "Fugitives?" Miles looked to the sheriff. "They running from the law, Walt." Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "There's been accusations of theft, company property." "That's a lie." Lydia's voice rang out as she stepped onto the porch, her face flushed with anger. "My husband had legal claim to our land. These men murdered him and burned our home." The children appeared behind her, wide-eyed and frightened. Davis smiled coldly. "Mrs. Barrett, how fortunate to find you well. We were concerned when you disappeared so abruptly." "I'm sure your concern was overwhelming," Lydia replied, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Just as you were concerned for my husband when you shot him in the back." "A regrettable incident," Davis said smoothly. "Your husband was armed and threatening our men. They defended themselves. Unfortunately, in the confusion, your home caught fire." He turned to the sheriff. "The children might be innocent in this, but Mrs. Barrett stole company documents before fleeing. We simply want what's ours." "The only documents in our home were our land deeds," Lydia shot back, "which burned with everything else we owned." Miles stepped subtly in front of Lydia. "Seems to me this is a matter that needs proper legal attention. Maybe a judge in Austin should sort it out." "That won't be necessary," Davis said. "We're prepared to be generous. Mrs. Barrett can walk away from this unfortunate situation. We'll even provide funds for her to start fresh elsewhere." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "All we ask is that she sign a simple paper releasing any claim to the land and acknowledging that her husband's death was an accident during a legitimate dispute." "You want me to absolve my husband's murderers?" Lydia's voice was incredulous. "I want to avoid further unpleasantness," Davis replied. "Especially for your children. They've seen enough tragedy, haven't they?" The threat was barely veiled, and Miles felt his hand drift instinctively to his gun. Sheriff Dawson noticed the movement and shook his head slightly in warning. "I think you should leave," Miles said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Barrett and her children are under my protection now." Davis's expression hardened. "That would be most unwise, Mr. Grayson. Blackwater values this territory highly. We wouldn't want to see your modest operation suffer." "Mishaps? I survived 4 years of war," Miles replied evenly. "Reckon I can handle whatever mishaps might come my way." The tension stretched between them until Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all take some time to consider options. Mrs. Barrett has been through a lot. A few days to think might benefit everyone. Davis considered this, then nodded curtly. 3 days, then we'll require an answer. He turned his horse, but not before adding, "Choose wisely, Mrs. Barrett, for your children's sake." The 3 riders departed in a cloud of dust. Miles watched until they were out of sight before turning to Lydia, who stood trembling with fury and fear. "They're going to take everything," she said, her voice breaking. "Again." Miles led her gently back inside, aware of the children's frightened gazes. "We'll figure this out. But first, I need to know everything, every detail about your land, about Blackwater's interest in it, about the men who came to your home that night." Over the next several hours, Lydia recounted everything she could remember. The Barrett homestead had been modest 40 acres of decent grazing land with a small stream running through it. Nothing spectacular, nothing that should have attracted the attention of a large outfit like Blackwater. "There must be something else," Miles pressed. "Some reason they specifically targeted your land." Lydia shook her head, frustrated. "Thomas never mentioned anything unusual. He was proud of the claim, said it was good land for raising cattle and children." She paused, then added, "He did spend a lot of time by the creek. Said he liked to fish, but—" Her brow furrowed. "He'd come back sometimes with rocks, not fish. I never thought much of it." "Rocks?" Miles asked, suddenly alert. "What kind of rocks?" "Just stones, I thought, gray mostly, some with sparkly bits." She shrugged. "He kept a few in a tin by his side of the bed. Said they were pretty." Miles exchanged a significant glance with her. "Those rocks might be why Blackwater wants your land so badly. There have been rumors of silver deposits in this territory." Nothing confirmed, but enough to draw interest from Eastern money men. Understanding dawned on Lydia's face. "You think Thomas found silver on our land? It's possible, and if Blackwater's investors got wind of it." He didn't need to finish the thought. Lydia sat back, absorbing this new perspective. That would explain why they came so suddenly, so aggressively. Her hands clenched into fists. "They killed him for rocks in the ground. Men have died for less out here," Miles said grimly. "The question is, what do we do now?" Davis wasn't making idle threats. "If you refuse to sign, they'll come back in force. And if I sign, I betray Thomas's memory and everything we worked for." Lydia looked up, her eyes suddenly sharp with determination. "There's another option. If there really is silver on our land, that claim is still legally mine. With proof, I could fight them properly with lawyers of my own. You'd need evidence. Samples from the creek, the original land deed." Miles frowned. "And you'd have to get back to your land to find any of it." "Then that's what I'll do," Lydia said firmly. "Tonight. That's too dangerous," Miles objected immediately. "Blackwater will have men watching the property, which is why I'll go alone." When Miles began to protest, she held up a hand. "I know the land better than they do. There are ways to approach that only Thomas and I knew about. A small gully that runs behind the property, hidden by brush. I can get in, look for any samples Thomas might have collected, and be out before dawn." "And if you're caught?" Miles demanded. "Then my children will need someone to look after them," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his. The weight of her trust silenced him momentarily. He stared at her, this woman who had collapsed from exhaustion just days ago, now planning to infiltrate land guarded by killers. "I'm coming with you," he said finally. "We'll leave the children with my neighbor, Ida Jenkins. She's a good woman, raised 6 of her own. They'll be safe there." Lydia's relief was visible. "Thank you. I didn't want to go alone, but I couldn't ask you to risk yourself further." "You didn't ask," Miles pointed out. "I offered. There's a difference." As the day wore on, they made preparations. Miles rode to the Jenkins homestead, explaining only that he needed to help Lydia with an urgent matter. Ida, a pragmatic widow in her 50s, asked few questions, simply nodding and saying the children were welcome as long as needed. By dusk, James and Emma had been settled at the Jenkins place, promised that their mother and Miles would return by morning. The children were understandably anxious about the separation, but seemed reassured by Ida's motherly confidence and her promise of fresh bread and honey for breakfast. Miles and Lydia set out as true darkness fell, riding double on his most reliable horse. The night was clear, the moon providing just enough light to navigate by. They traveled in silence for the most part, both acutely aware of the danger they were courting. After nearly 2 hours of careful riding, Lydia touched Miles's arm and pointed to a line of darker shadow against the night sky. "There, that's the ridge behind our property. The gully starts just beyond those trees." They dismounted, tethering the horse in a small copse, and proceeded on foot. The gully was, as Lydia had described, a narrow ravine, easily missed unless you knew to look for it, that wound behind what had been the Barrett homestead. They moved cautiously, using the brush for cover. As they neared what would have been the back of the property, the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the air. Lydia paused, her breath catching at the sight of the charred remains of her home. "Are you all right?" Miles whispered, touching her arm gently. She nodded, visibly steeling herself. "The creek is just beyond what's left of the house. If Thomas found silver, it would be from there." They crept forward, using the ruins for cover. No guards were visible, but Miles remained alert, his hand near his gun. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional call of a night bird. The creek was a small affair, hardly more than a trickle in some places, winding across the back of the property. Lydia led them to a bend where the water had carved a deeper pool. "Here," she whispered. "This is where he liked to sit." Said the fishing was best, though he rarely brought home more than 1 or 2. Miles knelt by the water, examining the rocky stream bed in the dim moonlight. Most of the stones were ordinary, but as he sifted through them, he occasionally found ones with a distinctive glint. He pocketed several samples. "These might be silver ore," he confirmed quietly. "Not rich deposits from what I can see, but enough to interest people who know what to look for." Lydia was searching the bank nearby. "Thomas would have kept better samples. He had a place." She moved toward a lightning-struck tree that leaned precariously over the water. "Here." He hollowed out part of this trunk to store his fishing gear. She reached into a natural cavity in the wood and, after a moment of searching, pulled out a small oilskin pouch. "This wasn't here before." He must have hidden it. They retreated to the cover of the ruins before examining the contents. Inside the pouch were several larger samples of rock clearly showing silver veins, and most valuable of all, a folded document. "The duplicate deed," Lydia breathed, recognizing her husband's careful handwriting on the envelope containing it. "He must have filed it in town and kept this copy hidden. He always said to have backup plans." Miles examined one of the rock samples. "This is definite proof. With this in the deed, you have a solid claim that even Blackwater's lawyers would struggle to fight." A sudden noise, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked, froze them both. "Well, what have we here?" a voice drawled from the darkness. "Seems like Mrs. Barrett couldn't stay away after all." 2 men stepped into view, both holding rifles trained on Miles and Lydia. Miles recognized one as Whitfield from their earlier encounter. The other was a hard-faced man with a scar running down his left cheek. "Hand over whatever you just found, madam," Whitfield ordered. "Slowly now." Miles shifted subtly, positioning himself between Lydia and the guns. "You're trespassing on Barrett land," he said calmly. "Mrs. Barrett has every right to be here," Whitfield laughed. "Barrett land, this is Blackwater property now, has been since we settled the previous owners. Tenancy issues." "You mean since you murdered my husband," Lydia said, her voice steady despite her fear. The scarred man spat. "Your husband should have taken the offer when it was made, would have lived longer." Miles's mind raced, calculating odds and angles. His revolver was accessible, but against 2 rifles, the chances weren't good. Still, he'd faced worse odds during the war. "What's going to happen here?" he said conversationally. "Is that Mrs. Barrett and I are going to walk away with what belongs to her. You boys are going to let us, because killing a woman and a witness would bring the kind of attention Blackwater surely doesn't want." Whitfield's expression turned ugly. Witnesses can disappear just as easily as stubborn homesteaders, Grayson. 2 more bodies in unmarked graves won't trouble anyone's sleep. Except perhaps Sheriff Dawson's, came a new voice from behind them. All heads turned to see the sheriff himself emerging from the shadows, his own rifle leveled at Whitfield's back. Beside him stood a younger man in a deputy's badge. "Lower those rifles, gentlemen," Dawson ordered. Now, after a tense moment, Whitfield and his companion complied, fury evident in their expressions. "Sheriff," Whitfield began, "these people are trespassing on Blackwater property. Save it," Dawson interrupted. "I heard enough of your conversation to get the picture." He nodded to Miles and Lydia. "Found something interesting, did you?" Lydia hesitantly showed him the deed and rock samples. "Evidence that this land is legally mine and that there may be silver deposits here, which explains why Blackwater was so eager to drive us out." The sheriff examined the documents and rocks, then handed them back. "Seems clear enough to me." He turned to his deputy. "Arrest these 2. Charges will include trespassing, threatening with deadly weapons, and we'll see what else sticks when we get statements about Barrett's death." As the deputy moved to comply, Miles asked the question foremost in his mind. "Not that I'm complaining, Sheriff, but why are you here?" Dawson's weathered face showed a hint of shame. "Been turning a blind eye too long to Blackwater's methods. Told myself it was just business, just progress. But when they started talking about children possibly getting hurt," he shook his head. "Man's got to draw a line somewhere. Figured I'd keep an eye on the property tonight, see if they tried anything. Didn't expect to find you 2 treasure hunting." After the prisoners were secured, the sheriff turned back to Miles and Lydia. "This evidence will help, but Blackwater's got deep pockets and friends in high places. This fight's just starting." "We're prepared for that," Lydia said with quiet determination, surprising Miles with the "we." Dawn was breaking by the time they retrieved Miles's horse and began the journey back. Both were exhausted but buoyed by their discovery and the unexpected intervention of the sheriff. "You think Davis will back down now that his men have been arrested?" Lydia asked as they rode. Miles shook his head. "Men like that don't back down easily. But with the sheriff on your side and proper evidence, you've got a fighting chance." They rode in silence for a while before Lydia spoke again. "When I said we back there, I meant it. I know I have no right to involve you further in my troubles, but—" She hesitated. "I've come to rely on you, Miles, more than I should, perhaps." Miles felt something tighten in his chest, hope, fear, longing, all tangled together. "You and the children have become important to me," he admitted, the words difficult for a man unaccustomed to speaking of feelings. "More important than I expected. I should take the children and go to my brother's once this is settled," Lydia said softly. "It would be the sensible thing." "It would," Miles agreed, though the thought left him cold. "Safer there, better opportunities." "Yes." She was quiet for so long that Miles thought the conversation finished. Then, so softly he almost missed it. "I don't want to go." Miles reined in the horse, turning slightly to see her face in the growing light. "Then don't," he said simply. Their eyes held for a long moment, both aware of crossing a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. "The children need stability," Lydia said, but there was a question in her voice. "They'd have it with us." Miles chose his next words carefully. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, but I think we could build something good here, together." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I think we already have." The children were overjoyed to see them return, rushing from Ida Jenkins's house with excited cries. As Miles lifted Emma into his arms and felt James wrap around his leg, he caught Lydia's gaze over their heads. The look they shared held promise, understanding, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name but both recognized. The battle for Lydia's land would not be easily won. Davis and the Blackwater Company would fight with every resource at their disposal. But with the sheriff's support, the evidence they'd recovered, and the unexpected alliance with neighboring small ranchers who'd suffered similar intimidation, they stood a fighting chance. More importantly, Miles realized as he watched Lydia laugh with her children. They had something worth fighting for, not just land or silver, but the chance to build a family from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. 3 months later, as autumn painted the Texas landscape in golds and reds, Miles stood on the porch of his cabin, their cabin now, watching Lydia hang laundry in the yard. The legal battle with Blackwater continued, but the tide had turned in their favor. Davis had been indicted for his role in Thomas Barrett's death, and while he'd posted bail and fled the territory, his absence had weakened Blackwater's position considerably. The silver deposits on Lydia's land had proven modest but real enough to provide security for her children's future, but not enough to attract further unwanted attention. With Miles's help, she'd established a small cattle operation on the reclaimed Barrett property, which they ran alongside his own ranch. James and Emma had thrived in their new circumstances. James shadowed Miles constantly, soaking up knowledge about horses and cattle with an eagerness that made Miles proud. Emma had started school in Redemption Springs, riding in with Miles twice a week and staying with the schoolteacher's family before returning home. Both children had nightmares sometimes about the night their father died, but those episodes were becoming less frequent as time and new happy memories pushed the darkness further away. As for Miles and Lydia, they had moved cautiously at first, mindful of her grief and the children's adjustment. But affection had blossomed naturally into something deeper, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. 2 weeks earlier, with the children's enthusiastic blessing, they had married in a simple ceremony at the Jenkins Ranch, surrounded by the neighbors who had become allies and friends. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Lydia asked, approaching the porch with an empty laundry basket. Miles smiled, reaching out to brush a strand of golden hair from her face. "Just counting my blessings. Never thought I'd have all this." "All this?" she teased. "A hard-working wife and 2 rambunctious children. Most would call that a handful, not a blessing." "I'd call it a miracle," Miles said simply. "One I didn't deserve but am grateful for every day." Lydia set down her basket and stepped into his arms, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. "I used to believe everything happened for a reason," she said quietly. "Then Thomas died and I couldn't see any reason good enough for that kind of loss. But now," she looked up at him, "now I think perhaps life doesn't give reasons, it just gives chances to begin again." Miles thought of that day months ago when he'd spotted a woman and 2 children making their desperate way across the open range. How close they'd all come to missing each other, to never knowing what might have been. "When I found you collapsed by your children that day, all I could think was that I needed to get them fed before you woke," he said, smiling at the memory. "Never imagined I'd be feeding them for years to come." "Are you complaining?" Lydia asked, her eyes sparkling. "Not for a second." He kissed her gently, still marveling that he had the right to do so. "Though James eats more than a grown cowhand these days." Lydia laughed, the sound bright in the clear autumn air. "He's growing. Emma too. They need a father's example." "And they'll have it," Miles promised, his arms tightening around her. "For as long as I live." From the barn came the sound of children's laughter as James tried to teach Emma to lasso a fence post. Soon they would call for their mother and Miles to watch their progress, proud of new skills mastered and eager for praise. The day would unfold as so many had before it, with chores and lessons, meals shared at the sturdy table Miles had built, stories by the fire as evening drew in. It was an ordinary life in many ways, far from perfect and not without its continuing challenges. But as Miles held his wife and watched their children play in the golden light of a Texas afternoon, he knew it was everything he'd never dared to hope for and more than he'd ever dreamed possible. "I love you, Lydia Grayson," he said, the words still new enough to feel momentous. She smiled up at him, her face alight with the same certainty that filled his heart. "And I love you, Miles Grayson, now and always." In the years that followed, their family would grow. The next spring brought the birth of a daughter they named Hope, followed 2 years later by a son they called Thomas, honoring the man whose love had given Emma and James life. The combined Barrett-Grayson ranch prospered modestly, never becoming an empire but providing well for the family that called it home. The Blackwater Company eventually dissolved amid scandal and financial troubles. The land they had seized from other homesteaders was returned through court orders or fair purchase, and the territory slowly transformed from a battleground of competing interests to a community of families with shared purpose. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work done, Lydia would remind Miles of their beginning of a desperate woman collapsing beside her frightened children and the cowboy who had promised to feed them before she woke. A simple act of kindness that had changed everything, proving that even in the harsh realities of the frontier, compassion could take root and flourish, growing into love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together.